Alrighty, good evening, everyone. I hope you were able to spend some time reviewing chapters 1 and 2, and then looking ahead for this week for chapters 3 and 4. As is with much of Trei Asar, we get to move pretty quickly and get to really complete whole units in a short period of time. So tonight we're going to learn together chapters 3 and 4 of Sefer Yoel and conclude Sefer Yoel. That's all 4 chapters. And be done with Sefer Yoel. So just as a very, very quick reminder, last week, chapters 1 and most of chapter 2 was essentially, according to the Radak, a very pshat-oriented, there's a plague in the land of Israel, something bad is happening. And it's about some sort of redemption from Hashem that takes place through this moment of having a plague, and the Kohanim and the temple and the focus on Yerushalayim. And that was most of chapters 1 and 2. The Abarbanel, on the other hand, read the whole chapter, even the pshat-oriented pieces about a plague, as the 4 kingdoms, right? He saw it as part of a grand scheme as to how the world is going to go through 4 kingdoms. The Jews are going to be oppressed, and finally redemption will come. At the very end of chapter 2, we saw some sort of redemption at the end as well. We're now shifting gears to chapter 3 and 4. Chapter 3 and 4, even for the Radak, even for the pshat-oriented Mefarshim, is not something in the present. It is certainly something in the future. It is something eschatological. It is something about some future redemption of the Jewish people. And that's what we'll look at this evening. Chapter 3, as you saw, is very, very short, but there's actually quite a lot packed into those very, few number of verses. So that's what I want to focus on with you again tonight. We'll also be looking a little bit at the Radak and the Abarbanel, who really go into details to what exactly is happening, and a little bit of Rashi as well. So without further ado, let's turn to chapter 3. I'm going to post it right here as well, just for anybody who did not receive it. All right, it's in the chat as well. All righty, I'm sharing screen. As always, please feel free to chime in if you have any questions or comments. Okay, so Yoel chapter 3, very short, 5 verses. So we're switching gears. We're talking about a new topic, something about the future. So how does it open, right? Yoel says, "V'haya acharei kain," afterwards, in some sort of perhaps future, "Eshpochet ruchi al kol basar." God will pour His Spirit on all of humankind. Kol basar. Interestingly, though, the Radak assumes basar does not mean all men, but rather just means Jews. Right? It's a bit of a strain there, because often basar, right? Vivarech kol basar, like in Ashrei, it's not about just Jews, it's everyone, but he assumes it's Jews because it's going to be about redemption of the Jewish people. What's going to happen? There's going to be some sort of prophecy among all of the children of Israel. Not only are they going to be Nevi'im, they're going to be Chalomot, kind of dreamers, meaning in some sort of prophetic way. And verse 2, the same thing for the slaves, the Avadim and the Shvachot. They're also going to be some sort of prophet. So what's happening just early on in verse 1 and 2? If anyone wants to chat it, or what do you think is happening in verse 1 and 2? You don't have to be shy. What's the Navi trying to get at here by saying that everyone's going to be prophet-like? So perhaps what the Navi is saying is essentially that in some sort of future time period, everyone will have some sort of either direct connection to God or some sort of knowledge, exceptional knowledge, that Hashem is the true God. It's not necessarily that everyone's going to really be a prophet, but rather that everyone will know that there's a true God. And that's certainly true amongst Jews, and even amongst the Avadim and the Shvachot, who are normally seen as like lower, both in terms of mitzvot, but also perhaps in their spirituality. So everyone, all the Jewish people, will recognize Hashem. It's essentially what's happening. Most Mefarshim assume it has to do with Deya, right? Knowledge of Hashem, Dat Hashem. They'll have some sort of Deya, understanding of Hashem. So that's how the prophet opens up, some future point where there's going to be Deya Hashem. Now we're going to switch gears in the opening here to what will happen once there's Dat Hashem. What happens? Natati moftim b'shamayim u'va'aretz dam va'esh v'timrot ashan. So we all know this phrase from another time of year. Get your pinkies out if you want. Right?
I've got it.
Yes. I see Avi Schreiber's hand up. But essentially, yes, it's Pesach. Goldarina?
Pesach, yeah.
Pesach, exactly. So this pasuk is used by Pesach, and we can talk about why it's really at Pesach. It's more for a Pesach shear. It's not necessarily the shot here. However, the connection with Pesach is we're talking about some sort of magnificent, almost like supernatural event. And when we do the all the 10 plagues, and then we do it Dam, Timrot, Ashan, etc., it's not only a reference to what happened in Egypt, but much of the Seder is also oriented to some sort of future redemption. So to pick up on themes in Yoel about a future redemption and throw it into our Pesach Seder actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's also about, right, one day making it back to the land of Israel as well. So that's perhaps why it ends up in our Pesach Seder. But what's going on here essentially is that there's going to be some sort of sign in the heaven, blood, fire, pillars of smoke. So it sounds like, wow, blood in the heavens, like this is crazy. What's going on here? So if you look at the Radak's perspective, again, he's a little bit more pshat oriented. And even if we're talking about something in the future, he wants to kind of lessen the miraculous when possible. Right? There's a push to do that by many Mefarshim. So what does he say? He says it's really like a metaphor. It means to say that at the end of days, there's going to be some battle in the land of Israel. And that battle will be the battle of Gog and Magog, the end of days. And so there's going to be bloodshed because there's going to be people dying. So Dam in the heavens doesn't literally mean it. It just means there's going to be bloodshed. And when he talks about in the pasuk that there's going to be like in the heavens, Dam and Eish v'timrot ashan, it's just destruction, right? Fire, smoke. It just references destruction, but it's not anything supernatural. Now, obviously, there are those who are going to interpret it that way, but that's the way that the Radak prefers to look at the pasuk. Let me continue. Two more psukim in chapter 3. He says, "Hashemesh yahafich lechoshech." The sun will darken. Vayareach ledam, and the moon will become like the blood moon, right? It's a reference. The moon does occasionally look red. Lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol b'hanara, before the day, the great day. And here seems to be a reference to the redemption, as opposed to in chapters 1 and 2, when the Radak would say, no, this is just some sort of kind of momentary redemption. But here it seems to be the redemption. Final verse. Everyone will call to Hashem and go yimaliki b'har Tzion. All the Jews will go to Yerushalayim, but even the non-Jews will go to Yerushalayim. We'll talk about this verse in a moment. Tiyeh pleitak hasher amar Hashem. There's going to be like the remnant of Jews living there. Ubasridim asher Hashem koreh, and the remnant whom God will call out to. Okay, so verse 4 focuses on this. Again, it seems very supernatural. The sun will darken, the moon will become blood. So if you want to kind of stay within this more pshat-oriented approach, maybe you would say what? It's a metaphor, right? It's not actually going to happen. Obviously, there are those who say, no, this is something that will happen. But within the framework of a metaphor, both Rav David Kimchi, the Radak, and the Abarbanel, and a number of others truly believe, and this actually is the major focus of most Rishonim and most Mefarshim on these psukim, recognize that these verses, since it has to do with the end of days, is a reference to the conclusion of the two major kingdoms or religions in the world. So I want to look at that inside because it's pretty powerful. This is the way that they describe it. Now, certainly Yoel didn't know of these two religions, Christianity and Islam. That's the ones that they're referencing here. But if you're a prophet, so you can prophesize about something in the future. So I want to show you that right now. If you look at source number 1 on your source sheet, I brought for you in a Abarbanel. We're not going to read the whole thing inside. It's quite lengthy. For anybody who's read the Abarbanel before, the Abarbanel by definition is lengthy. He goes on and on and on. But we'll just look at a few pieces, and I've underlined them for you, just to understand both the Abarbanel's approach and many others as well. So he opens up by saying, Harav HaMoreh Pirash, right? He's talking about I believe here is talking about the Rambam here, is referring to how it's a mashal, right? Fine. Go to the next line. And then one. What do we think this is about? According to the Abarbanel, Bein Edom v'Yishmael. The references to a moon and a sun have to do with Edom Christianity and Yishmael Islam. And he's now going to show us, display why he thinks that. Go to the next line. In the underline. The sun is a reference to Rome, Christianity. The moon is a reference to Islam. Now you may think, on the one hand, Christianity is much more solar religion. Islam is a much more lunar religion. We have a little bit of both. And there's many more references for each religion, why that may be the case. The sun becoming darkened is a hint to Edom, essentially Rome, being put back into its place, darkening. And then he continues. I'll just jump down to the underlined section here. He then explains essentially that these two powerful kingdoms, which are essentially the final kingdom, Christianity and Islam, they're going to essentially have a final battle in the land of Israel. What does he say? God's going to encourage somehow Rome, and its kings, he's going to make essentially Christians want to conquer the land of Israel. By the way, when's the Abarbanel living and writing this? The Abarbanel is living he lives through the expulsion from Spain. He dies in the early 16th century. During the time of the Abarbanel, he knows, and we'll see in a moment, he knows about the Crusades that happened a couple centuries ago. He knows that the land of Israel is currently dominated by Islam, not Christianity. He says, one day there's going to be a battle once more. They always look toward Eretz. They agree that Jerusalem is the place of Hashem. Ushar Hashamayim. Kol shekain, all the more so, l'da'atam shesham makom kevurat Yeshu, right? That's where Yeshu is buried, their Messiah. Hanotzri v'chol me'uyam ala eretzi. They're always looking, desiring in like a negative light. They're always wanting Jerusalem, and they always want the land of Israel because that is the place where they think their Messiah, essentially their deity, died, etc. He then goes on. I'm not going to read the whole thing inside, but if you're interested, between these two lines, he goes through historically. I'll just briefly mention it outside because it's fascinating. He essentially says, Rome ruled the land of Israel he lists the number of years, and then the Muslims conquered it, and then the first Crusades came, and then the Mamluks take over, and then the Christians come back, and he goes through the whole history and says, but at the end of the day, there's going to be one final battle. One more time, there's going to be a battle between Bnei Edom and Bnei Yishmael. And it will happen in Jerusalem, in Judah. Christians will conquer the Yishmaelim. One could argue that was World War I. And all the Arab nations, Muslim nations in Babylonia, Assyria, which would be modern day Iraq, Syria, etc., and from the east, they'll go to attack the Christians living in the land to avenge the blood of their brothers. And at the very end, he says, and at the very end of this, the battle of Gog and Magog will take place. That is essentially the battle, and they'll essentially harm each other. And who will become victorious at the very end? The Jews. But that's essentially what the Abarbanel says. Now, whether or not you read this and you buy into the Abarbanel's position is certainly up for debate. But it's quite fascinating how the Abarbanel will look at a Navi, look at a Perek, and he will take upon himself a massive historical vision. Now, I want to be very clear here. The Abarbanel has many times that he does this, and he often gives very specific dates, and they're almost always wrong. So I'm not to say that, I just want to be very clear here. Right, he has a whole book which he quotes here, Ma'yanei HaYeshua, which is a massive work on calculating messianic ages, and he goes through all these calculations, and whenever there's wrong, some of them were in his lifetime, and he changed it. So again, I'm not saying that this is the way that one should read the Navi, but I think it's quite fascinating that this is a very significant way in which people read the Navi. If you don't want to read it that way, then you just say there's some sort of change at the end of days. And the Shemesh and the Yareach represent as celestial beings some sort of massive earthly and celestial change when some sort of messianic age comes into being. Any thoughts or comments? That was quite a bit. So Rashi also adds, I'll just say that when it comes to the sun becoming like dark, he says it's essentially to tell people that those who worship the sun, it's not to be worshipped anymore because the sun's going to be darkened. So essentially, he's reading it less grand, but he's looking at it just from the more pshat approach.
Does the Abarbanel say there are five kingdoms or four?
Excellent question. So I believe the Abarbanel talks about 4 kingdoms here, if I'm not mistaken, but it's a machloket when you look at different Rishonim, how they count the 4 kingdoms. Because if you look at Mefarshim specifically in Muslim lands, they often actually have Islam as the 4th kingdom, not Edom, not Christianity. For the Abarbanel, though, it is Christianity, is the 4th kingdom, but that doesn't mean that the question is, how does the 4th kingdom fall? Right. So for the Abarbanel, the 4th kingdom falls through some sort of end of days battle between Yishmael and Edom. So that, I think that's how he reads it. Yeah. And by the way, when Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims in the first time in the 7th century, there are accounts of Jews assisting the invading Muslim conquest because they were treated so poorly by the Christians. And the same thing is true whenever usually when there was an invading force of Muslims, Jews often helped the Muslims because Jews lived significantly better under Islamic rule for all of history. The only real major exception were Jews in Iran for much of the last couple of centuries. It's a Sunni Shia distinction, but essentially Jews almost always preferred to live under Muslims than they did Christians. Okay, so that essentially is chapter 3. It talks about some sort of end of days vision, and the Jews who will survive and live in Yerushalayim won't really be harmed. Right? It's like there's a massive battle taking place, so all the Jews flee different parts of the land, go to Jerusalem, Har Zion. They're there as like a protective location. They'll let the other nations of the world battle it out, and then we're good again. That's essentially the vision that the Abarbanel says that will take place. Okay, any questions on chapter 3 before we turn our attention to chapter 4? Okay, so let's turn our attention to chapter 4. So again, chapter 4 seems to be part of the same conversation, right? It seems to be, now that we've talked about this great battle, now we're going to focus a little bit more on the details. What's going to happen to the Jews from around the world? What's going to happen to the nations that have kind of over the years, attacked the Jewish people, put us down? And chapter 4 is really going to be one of the major sources in Tanakh of Judgment Day, right? Yom HaDin, meaning not just our yearly Yom HaDin, but the Yom HaDin, right? For the world, Judgment Day. This obviously becomes much more prominent, I would argue, in Christianity, right? They have a big focus on Judgment Day. There's many, great Christian artwork that just depicts that. But this is one of the major sources for that. So I want to look at that inside with you. And we're not reading all of chapter 4 inside, but we'll look at pieces of it and share with you some of the Mefarshim and what's really going on here. So again, it opens up, in those days, right, in the future, right? I'll return the Jews to Judah and Jerusalem. Again, notice, and I've mentioned this last week, what's the focus? Judah and Jerusalem. There's not a focus on Yisrael. Right, so this also kind of tells us that this is like Israel's gone. We're talking about Judah and Jerusalem, the Judeans who were exiled. That's who we are, the Jews. They'll return at the end of days. And what's going to happen? And this is what I want to talk a little bit about. All the nations are going to come, meaning now that some sort of great battle has taken place between Ishmael and Edom, or between nations. So now Jews return to the land, and all the nations come with us. So is it all the nations? Is it the leadership of the nations? Unclear, but there's some sort of United Nations, coming to Jerusalem. And what's going to happen there? It's not going to be a show. It's rather going to be an actual court appearance of all the nations. V'huradatim el emek Yehoshaphat. I'm going to bring all of the nations down to the valley of Yehoshaphat. V'nishpatatimam. I will then judge them based upon all that they have done for my people who were scattered amongst their nations. Okay, a couple questions here. What's emek Yehoshaphat? Who's Yehoshaphat? So Yehoshaphat was one of the kings of Judah, right? We learned about him, I think, back in Malachim, right? So he's one of the kings of Judah, but there's no emek Yehoshaphat that we know of. So it could just be maybe he's buried there, maybe he built something there, so it's called emek Yehoshaphat. But more likely, it may have actually nothing to do with the king itself. Rather, it's emek Yehoshaphat because they're calling it the place where people are judged. So that's essentially what we're being told here, that it's the emek Yehoshaphat because that's where judgment will take place. Yehoshaphat v'nishpatati, and I will judge people in that location. So all the nations come to this place. And verse 3 continues, and it says, and I'll just read it, ve'el ami yado goral, those nations, what did they do to my people? They drew lots, and they made a child become a zona, a boy become a harlot, and a yalda, a girl, machur vayayin v'yishtu. They sold her for wine and drank it. What's this describing? What's happening to these?
Well, it's describing what happened when after the fall of Jerusalem in 70. So it's certainly prophesying that.
Yeah, that children, and that there's the famous Gemara about the children on the boat, for example. That children, Jewish children, were sold into slavery, into harlotry, and so on and so forth. And so God is saying, I haven't forgotten, and they're going to be judged for that destructive act that they did upon our people. So God is saying, all those terrible things that you did to our people, I am going to ensure that you're judged against that. And verse 4 essentially goes into that again. It tells us that there's going to be essentially judgment and retribution for what people did against the Jewish people. And I'm not going to read this inside now. We're going to skip down a little bit. Verse number 8, and God says, and I'll pull it up now. Yoel says what? Says the following. Yoel says, "Umacharti et bneichem v'bnotechem." What's Hashem going to do to the nations? Hashem is going to sell their children and their daughters, b'yad bnei Yehuda, into the hands of Judah. Lishvaim, to become Judean slaves of Jews, el goy rachok ki Hashem diber, to a nation far off. Meaning, just like they took our people and put them as slaves in the far corners of the earth, so their children will become slaves to us. Now, it may not sit so well, right? It's like, okay, just because they enslaved us, I don't read them as slaves. So that's I think a valid point to be thinking about when reading this pasuk. But essentially, what the Navi is trying to tell the nations of the world is that whatever you did to us, God is going to flip on you. But if you did terrible things to us, those terrible things will happen to you as well. And the Navi then says, Kiru zot bagoyim, verse 9, proclaim among the nations, kachu milchama, establish a war will happen, and there will be a war against the nations, meaning, and who's battling in this war? Doesn't seem like the Jews are. It sounds like the nations are either battling each other or Hashem in some sense is battling for us. Verse 10 is actually quite interesting. If anyone can pick up on what parallel we have here in verse 10. What does the Navi say? Kotu iteichem l'charavot. Beat your plowshares into swords. Umazmerotechem liramachim. Make your pruning hooks into spears. Hachalash yomar gibor ani. Let the weak say, meaning let everyone say, I'm strong. I'm ready to battle. What is this verse?
From Yeshayahu.
From Yeshayahu, but what's the difference?
Well, and Yeshayahu, nation shall not lift
It's
up.
the
war
opposite.
against nation.
It's the reverse.
They're having a war. It's a war against all against all.
Exactly. It's kind of fascinating, especially because this pasuk in Yeshayahu appears at the United Nations, right? Essentially to say that from Yeshayahu, that essentially, turn your weapons into tools of agriculture. The pasuk essentially is telling us don't have battles anymore. The pasuk in Yeshayahu says, "V'chitetu charvotam li'itim v'chaninotechem lamazmer." It's Yeshayahu chapter 2, verse 4. But here it's the opposite. Here it's take your plowshares, like you nations of the world who thought that you're peaceful now, everything's fine. The terrible tragedies that we did against the Jews is in the past. No. It's not over. Just because you did it 500 years ago does not mean your nation will not be punished today for what your nation did, because that sin still sits with them, and the pain is still felt with us. So the prophet Yoel is telling the nations of the world, prepare for battle. And the chalash, meaning like even the average person, is going to have to fight in this battle, because it's essentially, if you want to use like plain language here, it's essentially God is saying there's going to be a collective punishment against the nations of the world for that which they did against the Jewish people, right? If you are part of that nation, and again, obviously different nations are different, but essentially there's going to be a judgment made against the nations of the world for that which they did unto us. And that's kind of a powerful statement. And also shows the love that God has for the Jewish people, that God won't forget all of those times that we were slaughtered and attacked over the generations. God has not forgotten, and those nations will hear from God.
I have a question. Is Yoel talking to the nations, or is he talking to, Bnei Israel, to encourage them that there will be an end to the suffering? Who is he really talking to?
That's an excellent question. So if you look in chapters 3 and 4, unlike chapters 1 and 2, where there was actually a directive at some point to the Jewish people, chapters 3 and 4, at least what we've seen so far, and I can double check as we go along, there doesn't seem to be a particular audience referenced, meaning always the prophet is really talking to the Jews, meaning they're the intended reader and the intended listener, right? Yoel is speaking, and he's talking to the Jewish people, but it doesn't say that, right? The opening of both of these chapters just says, this is what's going to happen. Let me tell you. Yeah. And I guess today everyone knows it because it's translated into every language. So I guess everyone has it now. Yeah. So that's what happens. Any other questions or comments so far?
I just had a question back on verse 2.
Yes.
Where in verse 2, there's a reference to Yisrael, and whether that's to the lost kingdoms or the lost tribes or not, because all the others are to Judah, but that one he says to Yisrael.
In which verse are you looking at?
This chapter 2. I'm sorry. Where was I? Let's see. Yeah, my very own people, Israel. It's chapter 2.
V'nachalati Yisrael.
Oh, back in chapter 2?
No, back in verse 2, chapter 4, verse 2.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Okay. Yes. Alami v'nachalati Yisrael. Yeah. So that's a good question. I guess there could be one reference to the ingathering of Israel. I mean, in many books of Tanakh, you have a Yisrael and Yehuda, sometimes like the sisters. But I would say 98% of the references in Yoel are to Yehuda and Yerushalayim. So the fact that there's one verse in Yisrael could mean nothing, meaning it might not be meaningful. Or like you said, it could actually refer to the 10 tribes, especially in the context, like you mentioned, it says Pizru Vagoyim. These are the ones that were really scattered, right? Because Yehuda and Yerushalayim, at least in the context of, let's say, the exile after Beit Rishon is destroyed, right? They're scattered, but they're not really scattered, right? They're in Bavel. But with the 10 tribes, the notion is they're really scattered. So it actually that's a good point, it may really reference here the 10 tribes, at least in this one verse. Yeah. Okay. So let's continue onward. So essentially the next couple of verses going forward, verse 11, verse 12, verse 13, 14, really just talk about that God is going to judge the people. Again, we see the imagery of wine, again, like we saw in chapter 1. So you really do see the unity of the text, because even though it's talking about perhaps a different time period, the same imagery is used, right? The fact that there was no wine, right, in chapter 1 because of the plague that had afflicted the locusts, there was no wine. And now here we see that the wine press is full, and it's almost like a metaphor in chapter 13 for wickedness, right? Because they're using it improperly, just as the girl was sold for wine. So you see how wine is used here in a multitude of ways. And then we go back, and I'll now share my screen one more time, to a little bit more of the psukim themselves in verse 15. So verse 15, we go back to the sun and the moon, shemesh ve'ereach kadru, get darkened, ve'kochavim asvu nogham, and the stars are not as noga, are not as bright anymore. Something's darkening in the world, meaning because the nations of the world are being diminished, right? Because we, the Jewish people, are going to be elevated, they're being diminished. V'Hashem mitzion isha, God will roar out from Yerushalayim, and the whole world will shake. Le'amo u'ma'oz livnei Yisrael. So it's interesting. Here it says livnei Yisrael also, but I would think here, livnei Yisrael here, I would think is maybe more of a reference back to almost like Yitziat Mitzrayim b'nei Yisrael, because it uses the word livnei Yisrael. That's not as common in the Nevi'im, right? B'nei Yisrael is a much more Chumash word. So it's almost like saying that there's going to be some sort of redemption, like Yitziat Mitzrayim, where we're going to come out and be strong, like Bnei Yisrael were in that one time that happened so many years ago. So that, I think, is maybe part of what's going on. Okay. I want to show you all now the following verse, which we'll talk about for a few moments. Verse 17. What's the purpose of all this? Why is there a great battle in the land of Israel? Why are all the nations coming to Jerusalem to be judged? Why are we being elevated? In order, V'yidatem ki ani Hashem Elokeichem. This sounds like many other prophets. It sounds like Zechariah. It sounds like parts of Yeshayahu, that everyone should know that I am Hashem in the bold. Shochein b'tzion har kodshi. I dwell in Zion, in the holy mountain. V'hayta Yerushalayim kodesh. Jerusalem will become sanctified. The Zarim lo ya'avru ba od. Who are Zarim? Zarim are what? Are whom? Who are the Zarim who may no longer go to Jerusalem? Who's a Zar?
Non-Kohanim.
Asar.
So Zarim in the Chumash often refer to non-Kohanim. So, non-Kohanim can never go, into the innermost parts of the Beit HaMikdash. But it would seem that perhaps when you get to some Nevi'im later, in the end of days, the entire Jewish people have almost like an elevated status as Kohanim in some sort of sense, right? Because we become the Kohanim to the world, right? So if in the Chumash you have Kohanim in Israel, Levim in Israelim, so in the end of days, the whole Jewish people becomes the Kohanim. So the Zarim probably in this pasuk does not refer to non-Kohanim, but probably refers to non-Jews. that all of Jerusalem will become like the Temple Mount, like parts of the temple that were only for Kohanim. And now only Jews will be permitted to dwell in Yerushalayim because it's sanctified. All of Jerusalem becomes holy. Kodesh. Kodesh is a reference, like Kohanim can only eat Kodesh, right? And so therefore, non-Jews will essentially be told, you may not go beyond the walls of Jerusalem. You cannot enter.
Hello, Rabbi, but isn't this contrary to what Shlomo HaMelech said about the Beis HaMikdash, that all the nations of the world will come and pray there and offer sacrifices at the temple? Doesn't this seem to contradict that that prophecy?
Yeah, so you could look at it, I think it's an excellent point. You could look at it in two ways. Either you could say that there are two different visions of the end of days. Maybe one is a peaceful resolution to the end of days, and one is a more violent resolution. And therefore, as a result of the violence that the non-Jews inflicted on the Jews, they've lost that privilege. That's one approach. Another way is to say that Melech Shlomo, when he says that the nation, that this is a base tefillah for all the nations of the world. So that's true, like in the present, meaning in the good days of the Beit HaMikdash, like it may have been true during parts of Shlomo's reign, it may have been true in parts of Beit Sheni, but by the time you get to Beit Shlishi, some sort of future redemption, that will no longer be the case because of whatever happened throughout history.
Oh, so it sounds like one is kind of an apocalyptic prophecy, and the other one's more of like a natural prophecy in the part of Shlomo.
Yeah, it could also be stages.
How does that reconcile with the idea that at the end of days, all the nations will come to worship Hashem? That seems
So they'll
like
worship Hashem, but just like today, if I wanted to, bring a korban, so I'd ask you to finish it off for me, right? As a Kohen, I only go so far. So the same thing I think would be true. The nations of the world would bring their korbanos to the walls of Jerusalem, and then I would continue onward with it. I think that's like, as a Kohen, literally, a Kohen is the priest, almost like an intermediary in some sense. So we become that intermediary. Yeah, I think that's how to look at it. And by the way, the Radak just explains, like the Kedusha in Yerushalayim will elevate itself in such a way, he literally says, Ki tigdol kedushata le'atid. It's going to become so great that only Jews will be able to enter Yerushalayim. By the way, there used to be a sign, which I believe they have part of it in the Israel Museum, right? That was written in Greek, when you would go to the Rabbi, which would essentially give you the rules, right? Like only Israelim can go this far, and then there's another plaque that says only Kohanim may go beyond this point, right? Essentially saying like this is the border, and that's what they would do essentially in Yerushalayim as well. This is the border; no one can go beyond unless you're, a member of the tribe. Yeah. Okay. So let's finish up the chapter, and then we'll just talk a little bit about some broader themes in parts of the chapter 4 and Yoel in general. But essentially, the last couple of verses here. So it continues, chapter 18. It's some sort of beautiful imagery of the future of the land of Israel, right? The mountains will kind of drip. Yitfu he'arim asis. Asis is like a sweet, like wine. The mountains will have milk. It's kind of like this beautiful. There's going to be water everywhere, right, from the house of Hashem. And the notion that water comes out of Jerusalem, water comes out of the Beit HaMikdash, is a very common theme in the Nevi'im. Now, Mitzrayim lishmama tihiyeh. Egypt will become wasteland, desolate. Ve'edom lemidbar. Edom will become a desert. Shmama tihiyeh. Mechamas b'nei Yehuda, from all the destruction that they did against Jews. Asher shafchu dam naki be'artzam. Shah is that the Egyptians and the Edomites persecuted Jews in their own lands, meaning in Mitzrayim and in Edom. And therefore, they will be punished, that their nations there, Egypt and Edom, will become kind of wastelands. Now, Egypt, I guess you could say, well, I don't know, we were slaves there at some point, so maybe there's a second punishment, but God already punished them once. So it's got to be talking about some sort of future endeavor. And by the way, historically speaking, there were tens of thousands, if not many more, as reported actually by early Roman historians, that lived in Egypt, Alexandria, and most of the Jewish communities were wiped out in the early 2nd century in a revolt that took place. I think I mentioned it once before, around year 115 to 117. So maybe it's a reference to that they persecuted Jews, they killed Jews, so they'll be attacked one day. Edom is like a little bit more peculiar. I mean, Edom is what we would say is like modern day southern Jordan. Not exactly sure why Edom should receive such kind of great mention here. Mitzrayim I could understand.
Maybe because they participated in they helped with the destruction, like when the Babylonians came, they kind of chimed in against.
Yeah, so maybe they're guilty of assisting in
the destruction.
They're guilty by association.
Yes.
So isn't Edom Christianity?
So Edom, yes, very good point. So Edom in Pshat is just Edom. However, the way that Chazal read Edom when it comes to something like this is Christianity. So if we're talking about Christianity here, usually the partner in crime that we talk about is Edom and Yishmael, right? So that's not Mitzrayim. So what's going on here? Why would, if you want to read it that way, which is how the Abarbanel and the Radak and many others read it, they say this is going back to this Yishmael Edom reading. Why are we referring to Yishmael as Mitzrayim?
Well, could it be that because they took over, that Yishmael took over Mitzrayim? So
yeah, it became a Muslim land.
Right, and so it's symbolic of all of the Muslim nations. And just like Edom refers to all the Christian nations.
Yeah, Hagar was Egyptian, and that was Ishmael's mother, and he married an Egyptian. She found him an Egyptian wife.
Excellent. I want everyone 100%. If you look at the last source in our source sheet, the Radak it's the last page. It says source 2 on it. Radak on chapter 4, verse 19. He explains this, and as the Abarbanel says something very similar. It says Mitzrayim, very beginning. Zecher Mitzrayim ve'Edom. Mitzrayim, why we mention Egypt? Ba'avor Yishmaelim ve'Edom, because Mitzrayim is a reference to Yishmael. Ve'Edom ba'avor Malchot Romi. It's a reference to Rome. Why? Ve'ela shtei ha'umot hina ha'govrot zeyamim rabim. Right, they're the ones who ruled for many years. V'tiyena ad et ha'geula. Right, Islam and Christianity will rule until the end of days. Vihi chivta revia b'marot Daniel. So according to Radak, going back to what Jonathan Bling said, although this here is talking about the Radak, he sees Yishmael and Edom as kind of the fourth kingdom, kind of collectively. I don't know enough about the Radak's approach, generally speaking, but the Radak seems to think they're both. V'zecher Mitzrayim ba'avur Yishmaelim ki eshet Yishmael hayta Mitzri. So it's interesting here. Why we reference? So you mentioned Hagar, but that's going to be mentioned in a second. But also Yishmael marries a Mitzri. Shneimar vatikach lo imo isha me'eretz Mitzrayim, which makes sense because his mother's Egyptian. So she finds somebody from her hometown. V'chein imo Hagar Mitzrit. So even though Yishmael is not Egyptian, his wife and his mother are Egyptian. So essentially, it's part of the family. And therefore, the fichach yichas ha'uma azot l'Mitzrayim. It's kind of connected. V'zecher Edom b'avur Malchot Romi, and we know that Edom is reference to Romi for a number of reasons. And he goes on and kind of describes a little bit about the relationship between Edom and Yishmael and why they're referenced here. So essentially, what the Radak and the Abarbanel both see taking place here is that the reference to Mitzrayim is just a reference to Ishmael, meaning Islam. And you may ask, well, why do it in a roundabout way? Why not just reference it more explicitly? So it's an excellent question. There's no great answer. One is to maybe potentially say that it doesn't want to say explicitly because since often when prophets speak, they may be talking about something that happened in the future, but they often use the language of the time. So the same reason we say Edom and we don't say Christianity, meaning it's a code word that we only know because we're living today. But if you live during that time period, you may have no idea what Edom means. So it may be the same, which is that Mitzrayim was on the minds of the people in the time of Yoel. If they had just said Yishmael or something of that sort, it would have been totally meaningless. Would have been totally meaningless to a person listening at the time period. So different ways to look at it. But that's essentially what happens. And we'll read the last two verses now in the Sefer. So they're going to be destroyed. Verse 20 and 21, what happens now? Judah will forever be established, and Jerusalem for all generations. V'niketi damam lo niketi, their innocent blood I will not, clean up, meaning blood of Jews that has been lost over the generations, God will essentially not forget. V'Hashem shochen b'Tzion, and God will dwell in Zion. Right? God dwells in Zion, and therefore it's Kodesh. Right? Therefore, we can only live there, nobody else. And God is ending the Sefer, and we know this verse also from what?
Avarachim,
exactly, right? Which is composed shortly after the Crusades in Ashkenaz. And one of the references is that the blood of those who die al Kiddush Hashem, their blood should not be covered up because just like the blood of Hevel cries up from the ground, and there's other references in the Torah to that as well, blood cries out to Hashem saying, God, seek justice for the murder of my blood, of my body. So essentially God is saying at the end of the day, I will give Judah, the Jewish people, you will live in Jerusalem, you will live in Judah, you'll live in the land, but I will always seek revenge and avenge the loss of your life. So that's essentially how Yoel concludes. And it's kind of almost like it's justice, but it's not like parts of Yeshayahu where it's just like peace around the world. This is not the vision of Yoel. It's a very different type of vision. And overall, Yoel does tend to focus on the kind of the hard things, the plagues, the death, the bloodshed, right? He does heavily focus on that. And the vengeance that God will seek for those Jews whose lives were essentially lost. This essentially brings us to the close of Sefer Yoel. Before we open it up to conversation and comments, I just want to mention next week, we will learn one Sefer in 1 week, Ovadia. Ovadia is one chapter, and it also happens to be one Haftorah. So it's coming up in a few weeks. So essentially we get to do it all next week. So your homework is Sefer Ovadia. I'll send out a source sheet early next week with some extra sources as well. But now I'm happy to open up to questions or extra conversation about the Sefer.
So when he says that he will remember the blood, how does that fit in with the concept of Tchias HaMesim at the end of days? He's not only remembering the blood, he's bringing them back.
Yeah. So I think it's saying that God's going to bring back, us. And there's a whole question as to who God's bringing back among the nations. It seems that the general trend amongst Chazal is that most people around the world do have Tchias HaMesim, but it doesn't mean that they last. Meaning, there's Tchias HaMesim for Judgment Day, right? The early Gemaras in the Avodah Zarah, like the first 6 dapim, talk a lot about this. And a lot of it comes from Sefer Yoel, essentially, that the nations of the world will all come back before Hashem, and they'll be judged. And if they're judged unfavorably, so that's the end, right? Because the whole purpose of Tchias HaMesim is if a human being is made up of 2 components, a body and a soul, and they're separated upon death. So the only way to properly judge a human body and soul is if you reunite them, because you can't judge a body by itself or a soul by itself, so you have to reunite them. So that's what happens on Judgment Day, which is essentially what Yoel is describing. And so everyone comes back together, but the question is who's going to then stick around after Yom Adin?
With regard to the pasuk of Yehuda la'olam Teshev Yerushalayim L'dor V'dor, it's translated from generation to generation, but it essentially it's a synonym for the olam. Is that right? I mean, it's ending on a very positive note. So we will be around forever. And in the next verse, since God will dwell primarily in Sion, the connection I would imagine with Nikesi Damam Lonikesi is that there's a stronger connection or bond between God being there in Yerushalayim and not allowing the blood not to be avenged, just like we have for Cain and Hevel. We have where God says, "Kol demei achicha soakim elai minhu adama." In other words, there is that notion that blood has to somehow be avenged, and here especially so because God dwells in Jerusalem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also just has to do with if God is more present in our lives, if God is felt, right, when God comes down to Jerusalem. So finally, if for so long justice seemed so far away, if God is with us, so then God is going to ensure justice is found.
Well, not just with us, but within the land. The land itself cries out for justice.
Yes, I like that. But even Jews that were killed outside the land are seemingly included in this. This obviously, it also says it explicitly, but yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, you know that verse 20 is a takeoff from Eicha. You know, at the end, Atashem Lolam Teshev Kisachar Lador Bador, and you mentioned other intertextual references to Yeshayahu and the like. You know, in fact, I think Yeshayahu is one of the few places that Yerushalayim is called an Ir HaKodesh. You know, I'm wondering. I missed last week's class, and I'm sorry about it. I had a Shiva call, but how do you date the book?
Yeah, so there's a major machloket in terms of Yoel. So, you know, if you look at, let's say, the Dot Mikra, so they're going to date the book as being perhaps as late as like Chagai and, kind of like the return to Zion in Beit Sheni, like because of the focus on Yehuda, Yerushalayim. It sounds like there's some sort of return in chapters 1 and 2, like it's the beginning of the second temple. That's what it sounds like. But then if you look at, let's say more traditional Mefarshim, some of them like Rashi puts like a host of potential options. His are early, like Sefer Malachim, like earlier. I would tend to believe that we're talking about a person speaking while by Rishon still exists, because there are so many references in the first chapter to Jews, Kohanim specifically, crying out, doing tshuva, fasting in the temple. So it sounds like there has to be a temple around for this to happen. And according to the Radak and many others, the first chapter and a half at least are taking place during the life of Yoel. So it makes me think that this is taking place during the latter part of the first temple. Yeah.
It just seems that chapter 1 and 2 are so different from 3 and 4. Like the first 2 chapters seems like it's talking to Bnei Israel, and then the 3 and 4 to all the nations.
Yeah, in many ways, we find this with a lot of Nevi'im. I mean, Yeshayahu, there's that whole discussion about, Isaiah 1, Isaiah 2, and, Ira Tokayer is much more expert on this topic than I. But nevertheless, there are so many textual connections. So even though you can say the prophecies should be split in 2, put 1 and 2 in one bucket, the 2, 3, and 4 in another bucket, which is true, right? They're different. One's very future oriented, one's very present. But if you look at the words, if you were to like sit them next to each other, the language, the words, just like you can tell it's the same voice. even though it has different messages, but that's okay. Meaning you can have different messages in one book. It just, I think that's what I see here. Any other thoughts, comments? I imagine this was the first time most of us have learned through Sefer Yoel, so congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful.
Thank you.
So we'll pick up same place, same time next week with Sefer Ovadia. It's one chapter, focusing primarily on Edom, which is why it ends up being the Haftorah in was it Parshas? It's not Toldot. It's forgetting which one offhand. But okay, great.
Yeah, it's Vayishlach.
Vayishlach. Okay, thank
Right,
you.
by
That's
Mr. Parsha.
one of them. I think you're right. Yeah, it's the one with Asar.
Of course, I'm right.